Okay, good morning, everyone. Let's dive in. As you well know, we are approaching the end of the semester. We have 3 lectures up on the schedule here that end before the end of the lecture period. We're going to take our time with these 3 lectures. There's a couple that I had to drop in the interest of time, so we might revisit some of the older topics. But at least in lectures 22, 23, and 24, we are going to finally reach the edge of human knowledge in terms of automatically designing robot bodies and brains. So I appreciate your patience as we've spent quite a bit of time in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. We're going to finally now reach what we are just able to do in robotics and the things that we're just not quite able to do. So for some of you, this might be the first time in a class you've actually reached the edge of human knowledge, so we're going to take our time and explore the bleeding edge. Okay, how are we going to do that? We're going to finish up our lecture on soft robotics this morning. We're going to look at a couple of research projects that were published in the literature over the last few years, and then we will move on to differentiable robots. We're going to finally shed our evolutionary algorithm, which is very computationally inefficient. It does everything through trial and error, and you've probably been listening to the fan on your laptop, which is the reminder how inefficient things are. At the bleeding edge, we are now, as a community, as a research community, just figuring out how to automatically design bodies and brains of autonomous machines in a non-random manner. We're going to throw away trial and error and do things in a more principled, computationally efficient way. Okay, before we get there, let's go back to soft robotics. And just as a reminder, we're working now with a soft-bodied simulator where the graphics are going to show voxels that get bigger and smaller, twist and turn and deform. But under the hood, the physics is running on beams that connect neighboring voxels together. I wanted to just come back to this slide for a moment. I misspoke here because I always get confused about yaw, pitch, and roll. I want to just make sure we're all on the same page about this. Remember that K and K sub phi represent stiffnesses. K contains 3 stiffnesses and K sub I contains 3 different stiffnesses. K, let's see if I can get this right now. K represents how much a beam resists relative motion of the 2 ends of the beam. So there's 3 possible ways the 2 ends of the beam, which I'm going to represent with my 2 fists, can move, change positions relative to one another. This, and this. Yeah? Okay. K sub phi represents the 3 ways that the 2 ends of the beam can rotate relative to one another. This, and this. And those 3 are yaw, pitch, and roll, and I can never get them straight which one they are. So if all 6 of these numbers is very high, what is that beam's behavior? It resists all of those relative motions. It's a steel beam, right? If all 6 Ks are low, how does that beam behave?
It moves kind of everywhere. It's like a slinky.
It's kind of like this, or a slinky, right? We're not dealing with springs here. These are materials, but they also have stiffnesses and resist relative motion and relative orientations. Yeah. Most of us are familiar with isotropic materials in which all of the K values are more or less the same as each other. So steel is an isotropic behavior. It can be, all of the K values are very similar, and they're similarly high. A big tranche of rubber, same thing. Anisotropic behaviors have very different K values. So for example, you might have a material that resists being stretched or compressed, but shear, which is these 2, It allows those quite a bit. It's quite permissive of those. There are materials in nature that have these properties. That's what we're doing when we change the K values. Or in the experiment led by Nick Cheney that we started to talk about last time, if evolution, the evolutionary algorithm, starts to set the K values. How does an evolutionary algorithm set the K values? By using HyperNeat, which, remember, HyperNeat evolves particular types of neural networks, where each neural network in a HyperNeat population paints stuff onto something else. In this case, our CPPN, here's an example over here, is painting different K values onto those beams, which you can't see, but they're represented in the visualization as differently colored voxels. I'll start up the video and we'll watch the evolutionary process again here. Here we go. Okay, we're watching the most fit CPPN in the population at each point in evolutionary time. We've got a standard fitness curve with evolutionary time on the horizontal axis and the fitness of the most fit CPPN in the population showing the phenotype that it produces. Remember that these CPPNs are configured to paint a voxel or not paint a voxel into a particular position, which gives us the three-dimensional shape. And then for all the voxels that were dropped by that CPPN, whenever that CPPN drops a voxel, it also drops some paint or K values onto the beams of that voxel. Everyone got that straight in their head? That's how we're evolving bodies and brains of soft robots. Question? All good? Okay. All right. Okay. So now that we can evolve soft robots, similarly to the way we've been looking at evolved rigid robots throughout the semester, what good are they? What can we do with them? Our good friend the octopus showed us at the beginning one of the practical and obvious and engineering applications of soft robots is they might be able to get places that would be hard to get otherwise. If we have a very cluttered and fragile environment, like after a natural disaster, you could imagine soft robots crawling through the rubble. I have a colleague at Tufts University that does work on exactly these soft robots. And the idea would be to create a soft water bottle. So you have a water bottle that's wrapped in this soft actuated material. Why would you want to create such a thing?
Like you're talking about with searching for people in disasters, say they're stuck under something we can't get them out of yet, they're gonna need water, they can dehydrate, that'll help them stay alive there longer until we can get to them.
So in a large-scale natural disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami, the highest mortality rate is from falling rubble and the immediate after effects, the immediate effects of the natural disaster. The second highest mortality rate is death by dehydration. So how do you get water to survivors underneath the rubble before you can extricate them from the disaster site? Okay. Assume we could make such a soft robot enveloping a water bottle. How does that robot get to the human survivors? They're trapped under rubble, so assume their phones aren't working, there's no GPS, no triangulation. If we were to fly over this site with a helicopter and drop 500 of these water-filled soft robots onto the disaster site, how do they get where they need to go?
Infrared might work, trying to find where there's hot bodies.
Possibly infrared, so we could use heat. So let's think about all the different kinds of robots and environments and fitness functions and neural architectures we've seen in the course. So heat is one possibility, but it's got a drawback. What is it? Think about the news footage you've seen of large-scale natural disaster sites.
There's other rooms that are hot.
There's other things that are hot. That's one problem. Okay, so we dropped 500 water bottles. Some of them actually find smoldering fires rather than human survivors.
People might be like stuck under something, so you can't see the heat from above.
So it's difficult. Heat does not radiate very far in a cluttered environment. It's good for close up. If the water bottle gets within a few feet or a few meters of a human survivor, they might be able to use it. Use it how? Assume you're a water-filled soft robot and you're navigating, pushing, or peristalting yourself through narrow apertures in a cluttered three-dimensional space of debris. And you suddenly sense a little bit more heat on one side of your body than the other. Is this sounding familiar?
This is like one of the original bots that tracks towards the light.
Track towards the light, right? The Bratenberg vehicles. So the lover was the one that turned towards the light. We talked about that behavior, which is known generally as phototaxis, meaning a machine or an organism. Phototaxis, a machine or an organism that orients itself relative to this physical phenomenon, light. We're now talking about thermotaxis. Also a lot of organisms that do this. Thermophilia, turn towards the light. Thermophobia, turn towards the heat. Thermophobia, turn away from the heat.
What about like audio?
Audio, probably pretty good as well. Travels further than heat in an underground cluttered environment. Also has some limitations. What's the pros and cons of audio? The pro is it gets a little bit further than heat. What's the drawback here?
Might be harder to triangulate.
You got a lot of echoes, reverberations. You remember when we talked about? Oh, actually, we skipped that lecture. Never mind. Yes, difficult to triangulate. So we have a water-filled soft robot, and you hear more sound on one side of you than the other. You could do phonophilia, turning towards the sound, but that's tricky because of echoes and reverberation. Okay, pros and cons for heat, pros and cons for sound. What else is available?
Could you use like CO2 signatures, like how mosquitoes do to attract it?
Insects always have a lot to teach us. So here, CO2 is probably your best indicator. It will diffuse quite a long distance. That's why you get covered in insects when you go camping. They can actually detect you from quite a long way away. Better yet, create a Bratenberg vehicle that combines all of these signals to get a more robust signal to turn towards the human survivor. Okay. All right, so several advantages to soft robots just from the fact that they can navigate some environments better than rigid robots. There's some other potential advantages of soft robotics, which is resiliency. So you may or may not remember our evil starfish from a few lectures back, where it learned how to walk by evolving a simulation of itself, and then using that evolved simulation to evolve controllers for itself. That was stage one of the experiment. Stage two of the experiment is we cut off part of the robot's leg. Its body had changed, but because the evil starfish is capable of creating a self-model, it's able to evolve a simulation to describe itself. If something changes, evolution simply discards the old model, which described the robot as a four-legged creature, and evolutionarily replaces it with a new self-model or a new simulation, which is a 3.5-legged robot. So with rigid robots, they can change their self-model if something goes wrong, but what they can't do is recover the leg itself. So with soft robots, in a paper from a few years back, we looked at this concept where we went back and revisited this idea of the evil starfish. We evolved controllers for a whole bunch of soft robots, the soft robot equivalent of the evil starfish. And then we would remove parts of the body to see how the soft robots recovered. I'm going to play you this video in a moment. In this case, we chopped off the front 2 legs of the soft robot. And we let the evolutionary algorithm do what it did in the case of the evil starfish, which is create a compensating controller for the new body. I'm going to skip over the self-modeling part of the soft robot. That's not important for our purposes. For our purposes is the goal of this robot, the mission is, as always, surprise, surprise, move as far to the right as possible. But this robot suffers a whole bunch of different kinds of injuries. It still has to move to the right. So whatever controller this soft robot had when it was intact, it's going to have to discard it and come up with a new controller to move in the damaged state. Before we move on, what's the controller in the case of these soft robots? What are the controllers doing? A controller has to connect to a motor somehow and cause some change in the body of the robot. What does the controller do in these soft robots?
It's connected to CPG that causes it to expand and contract.
It causes it to expand and contract. Close. Remember, what's that?
The material.
Which material? We got voxels and beams.
The beam.
The beams, right? So the voxels, which you're going to see, remember, it's a bit of an illusion, right? This is just for the visualization. So underneath are the beams. What's the connection from the controller to the beam?
Changes the equilibrium length of those beams, so it can shorten it and make it have like a stronger pull, or extend it and make it a stronger push.
Absolutely. So every beam in the soft robot you're about to see, and every beam in Nick Cheney's experiment that you saw before, at least the red-green voxels, which were the ones that were actuated, there is a motor neuron from the controller attached to that beam. We talked about chopping that beam in half and assuming there's a spring connecting those 2 beams together. And a positive value at the motor neuron says, extend the resting length of the spring. Make the spring want to be longer, which results in the beam elongating. If the value in the motor neuron is negative, that negative value is saying contract or reduce the resting length of that spring. That spring will now try and shorten, and it will pull the 2 ends of the beams together. If that beam is a beam of steel, it has a very high K value for this particular relative motion, then it doesn't matter what the motor neuron is going to send, the beam is going to resist the spring trying to push the 2 pieces of steel apart or together. If that K value for a given beam is very low, then that motor neuron can very easily push apart the 2 ends of the beam or pull the 2 ends of the beam together. That's the controller. That's the motor neurons. The sensor neurons here are just CPGs. So we have open loop control here. There's just a sinusoidal pattern that's being sent directly into the spring in these experiments. So far, so good? Okay, here we go. Okay. This is the best this robot can do when it's been chopped in half. Doesn't look great, but I think about being chopped in half myself. I don't know that I do much better. The more grievous the injury is, if the only thing you can do is adapt your controller, there's only so much you can do. You can probably see where we're going with this. What is this robot capable of? Not too much, except in the case of a soft robot, the controller and the motor neurons in the CPG, they can push and pull in the beams, push and pull on the beams, which ends up deforming the entire 3D geometry of the robot, and you can get something that looks like this. So here's a controller evolved for the intact robot. In a moment, you're going to see us cut off all 4 legs. After we cut off all 4 legs, the evolutionary algorithm evolves a compensating controller and comes up with this. This is another thing that soft robots can do that rigid robots cannot do. Rigid robots, by definition, cannot change their morphology. They cannot adapt their morphology. All they can do is adapt their controller when unexpected things happen. Soft robots have the option. They actually have three options. If something unexpected happens, like any of these things here, the soft robot, or the evolutionary algorithm that's evolving controllers for that robot, can either try and adapt the controller to see if they can get the injured robot moving again. That's option A. Option B, change the body of the robot, adapt the body of the robot by sending a few commands to the motor neurons to deform the body, and then use the original controller. So adapt the body, don't adapt the controller. Option C, obviously, is adapt body and brain in the wake of unforeseen circumstances. I'm going to play this video for you again. In this case, what you're actually watching is option B. In this case, the evolutionary algorithm itself, quote unquote, chose to leave this controller, the intact controller, alone, and it's only the compensating controller. All it does is shift the resting length of some of the beams to this, and now you're watching the original intact controller controlling, in effect, a different body. So far, so good? Makes sense? Okay. Kind of cool. It came up, basically, rediscovered regeneration. They're not quite the same four legs, but it almost looks like it's, quote unquote, growing back lost structure. Many species on this planet are capable of that. Humans, unfortunately, are not, at least for now. We'll see what happens in the future. Okay. One of the surprising things that happened as we were running this experiment happened in this case. So in another run of the evolutionary algorithm where we chopped off half the legs, this happened. So we were thinking maybe it would try and regenerate or regrow the lost two legs. Evolutionary algorithms, again, they don't always follow human intuition. Apparently, or in retrospect, an equally good solution, retract the remaining two legs and revert back to an older form of locomotion called you've got it in your trachea. It's how you swallow food. Very important. Peristalsis, back to peristalsis. Okay. Any questions about that experiment before we move on? Okay. All right. About 5 years ago, with the advent of GPUs, as GPUs became more and more useful or more and more widespread, my lab took Voxcraft, which you see here, which runs on a CPU, and realized that a lot of the calculations, the F equals ma calculations, let me go back a few slides. Remember that the physics engine under the hood figures out how to change the accelerations of the endpoints of the beam, the A, by summing up forces and the masses surrounding that beam, taking F equals ma, arranging it into A equals F divided by m, and running that equation many, many times in parallel for all the beams inside a robot. One of the things, or the thing that GPUs were designed to do is to do simple matrix algebra over and over again very quickly in large numbers in parallel. So one of my lab members figured out how to take that calculation and GPUize it. And the magic of GPUs is once you do that, it allows you to do many more of these calculations in parallel. You can see that visually in this experiment. Now, this is running on a GPU, or ran on a GPU several years ago, which allows us to simulate many, many more voxels in parallel. We can build robots with more complex three-dimensional geometries because we can work with more and more smaller cubes. So once we figured out how to GPUize this soft-bodied simulator, we started to think about, well, if you could build a robot with lots and lots of small cubes to make cool, interesting, complex shapes, what kind of cool, interesting 3D shapes might you want to make? One of my lab members said, why don't we tackle fractals? You are many things. One of those things that you are is a fractal. So if we were to zoom in on your vasculature system in your whole body, you know what it looks like. It looks like a tree. If you zoom in on one part of your vasculature system, guess what it looks like? A tree. If you were to zoom in on a tiny bit of the capillaries in the tip of your finger, guess what it looks like? It looks like a tree. Same thing with your pulmonary system. When you breathe in and out, it's relying on fractal geometry to maximize surface area to volume ratio. There are very, very good biomechanical reasons for animals and plants, for that matter, to be built as fractals. They're everywhere in nature. So the next project we looked at, obviously, is let's try and build fractal robots. Okay. This is the user interface, so you could see the robot, you could see these fractal robots. In this last soft robot experiment we're going to talk about today, we posed the following question. Now that you can make robots with very complex 3D geometry, and we can make fractal robots, okay, what use is that? One of the uses of making fractal robots is that if you can get an evolutionary algorithm to design the body and brain of a small robot, and you then put a whole bunch of those small robots fractally together into a bigger robot, in theory, the bigger robot, which is made up of smaller robots, should do the same thing that the smaller robot did. The underlying mathematical principle underneath fractals is self-similarity. So as you zoom in or zoom out, you see similar structure. That's self-similarity. What you just saw in the previous video was geometric self-similarity. Our big table robot here, it looks the same at different spatial scales. What about behavioral self-similarity? So one of the things that your lungs is good at is if we look at your lungs as a whole, it's able to exchange a lot of oxygen across the high surface area to volume ratio. That's the behavior of your lungs. If you zoom in and look at one small part of your lungs, it's also good at the same behavior, maximizing O2 and CO2 transport because of high surface area to volume ratio. So in this fractal robot experiment, what we looked at was, could we create robots capable of behavioral self-similarity? Make a small robot that locomotes in a particular way, assuming that's our desired behavior. And then if we put them together fractally, do we get the same behavior, locomotion at the large scale? Turns out the answer is not always. So this video is entitled Good Alone, Bad Together, or Good Alone, Bad as a Fractal. So the video that you see on the left, this is HyperNeat running. It's figured out the 3D geometry and a distribution of stiffnesses across the beams inside this robot. You'll notice that we were still trying to figure out the physics. We didn't have that quite right yet at this point. You can see it's trailing this little trajectory, so we get a visual sense of how this robot moves, what this behavior is. It is rightward motion. We put a whole bunch of those small robots together, and they don't do, the larger robot does not exhibit behavioral self-similarity. You lose the good behavior of the small robots when you put them together in this way. It's a little difficult to see. Well, I guess it's not that difficult to see. In this case, the CPPN filled the empty cage. So it placed a voxel at every possible position. So it's a cube, full cube made up of cubes. Over here, we do the same thing. We follow that geometry to build this thing. In another evolutionary run, the robot, the evolutionary algorithm came up with this 3D geometry over here. This is the converse case. This is also a failure. In this case, the CPPN, the small robot, doesn't do what we want. It doesn't locomote, but the fractal robot does. So bad alone, good together. I forgot to mention one other detail of this experiment is every CPPN is evaluated twice. The first time, we take the CPPN and paint in this small cage to make the small robot, evaluate the behavioral fitness of that small robot. That small robot has a particular 3D geometry, so we take that geometry and we copy that robot according to this geometry. That's geometric self-similarity. It's built in. Everybody see that? So we've evaluated a CPPN once to produce this robot, and we record its behavior. We use its geometry to build the big one, and then we simulate the big one and compute its fitness. So now we have a fitness, for a given CPPN, we have small fitness and big fitness. And in this experiment, we just summed them together. We wanted to evolve CPPNs that could paint small robots that did what we wanted. And when we put those small robots together fractally, the big robot also did what we want. So the two videos that you just saw were medium fitness solutions. The CPPN figured out how to get one of the two robots to do the right thing, either the small one or the big one. We wouldn't be talking about this experiment if we didn't get the result you're about to see, which is good alone and good together. Okay, aside from being a way to show off or test drive this GPU-driven physics engine, what might be the practical use of building robots in this way? We've just spent a little bit of time talking about the engineering advantages of soft robots over rigid robots. What might be an engineering advantage of fractal robots capable of behavioral self-similarity over non-fractal robots?
Could it be related to like the self-replication where you can get a bunch of these small robots somewhere that you can't normally fit the altogether one and then have them come together and create a bigger version of themselves to do the same task?
Absolutely. So we drop 500 small water-filled robots onto a disaster site, and they find their way into 500 different very small, narrow apertures in the disaster site. And as they now start to penetrate this disaster site, some of them drop into a chamber that is an empty chamber that is 10 times the size of the aperture that they just crawled through. They might try individually to crawl through this much larger hole in the disaster site, but if they can find some of their neighbors, they come together, and they know that if they self-assemble self-similarly, they're going to get a bigger version of themselves, which does the same thing, which might be just peristalt and do a little bit of thermophilia and a little bit of CO2 philia. For a lot of practical domains where we want to actually deploy robots, there are cases where the robots need to move very carefully through very small apertures, and other cases where they, in the same situation, need to move through very big, hollow, open spaces. The geometry of a disaster site is geometrically self-similar. If you zoom in on a small part of a disaster site, you see a whole bunch of debris and some small openings and large openings. You scale out, you see the same thing, a bunch of debris and a bunch of small and large vacuums.
This might be like a little backtracking, but what's the sim to real like gap compared to, or with like these soft robots?
Yep.
We can't necessarily actually model the beams and the boxes themselves. We simulate like the expansion. So how do the controllers go from like beam extension to expansion of the cubes and stuff?
Not very well at all. So the sim to real gap is horrendous here. I promised you that this is a relatively new branch of robotics, a lot of unsolved problems. This is one of them, what you just said. How do we take simulated beams with 6 stiffness values and translate that into, in this case, hollow voxels with pressurized air being pulled in and out of them? There are other possible hardware instantiations or hardware realizations of the underlying soft-bodied physics. This is just one of them. I have another colleague at Cornell who works with metal foams. As the name implies, it's an exotic material that is a foam, but the non-hollow part of the foam is a metal. Try and simulate that in your head. Yeah? So material science, the gap is very large here. It's unsolved. It hasn't been crossed yet. Here's arguably one of the best attempts to cross it, and it's not great. That's the con. The pro is that material science is starting to come to the roboticists' rescue and offer a growing range of exotic materials with exotic properties that might actually narrow the gap. Imagine a metal foam, so it's relatively rigid, but you can still push air into and out of it. One of the nice things about metal foams is you don't get buckling. A metal foam cube, if you pull air out of it, will sort of get smaller, but still be like a cube. And if you push pressurized air into a cube of metal foam, it'll get bigger and still more or less be a cube. Not perfectly, but there you go. Yeah? Okay, good question. Okay. Just for fun, again, to test drive our GPUs, at the end of this evolutionary algorithm, which did find a CPPN that can paint small robots that do what you want, and when you put those small robots together self-similarly, the big robot does what you want, which leads to this question: can you keep going? Can you put the big robots together to make a super massive, big, super cool robot? You'll slowly start to see the trajectory emitting from the left-hand side of the robot. Kind of. We were really pushing the limits of what our GPUs could do back then. We mentioned recursion in this class a few weeks back. The non-CS majors, you might not be familiar with that idea of recursion. This is another version of recursion. Same idea here, right? We just keep repeating something, and if it worked when we hopped from here to here, recursion tells us that usually that means the hop from here to here would also work. And the hop from here to here, which we still can't simulate even on a super high-powered GPU machine, might also work. Whether we need this amount of geometric detail, I don't know. Okay. Any other questions about soft robots before we move on to differentiable robots? Okay, here we go. All right, as promised, in this lecture, we're going to reach the limit of human knowledge about how to automatically design bodies and brains of robots. So before we dive into lecture 22, let's just motivate this idea a little bit and consolidate some of the ideas we've already talked about in this class. Okay, so remember that we have whenever we're designing the body and or brain of a robot, under the hood we have a genotype. We have a blueprint or some data structure that describes the thing we want to make. The simplest case, which you've been playing around with in your final projects, is to have a vector of floating point numbers. In your case, each floating point number represents a synaptic weight. We could, for example, have a vector of just 2 floating point numbers, and they represent the 2 weights of the 2 synapses inside a Bratenberg vehicle, right? It's kind of the simplest case. Remember that if we can't figure out what these synaptic weights should be to produce the behavior we want, so far we've been seeing in this course, we use an evolutionary algorithm, which if this particular set of values produces an okay version of whatever we want the robot to do, we make a randomly modified copy of this vector. Maybe we alter the first number a little bit and we don't alter any of the other numbers. There's no way that we can know until we simulate this robot that this set of synaptic weights produces better behavior or worse behavior relative to this parent. Why not? How do we not know until we simulate it? Remember when we talked about evolutionary algorithms, we developed this intuition pump or this metaphor of the fitness landscape. Let's go back to the fitness landscape for a moment. Simplest case is to start not just with two numbers, but a single number. I don't know if you remember Bradenburg Vehicle 1. It had one temperature sensor on the front and one wheel on the back and one synapse connecting that one sensor to that one wheel. And Bradenburg invited us to think about that little robot swimming around in a pool, and it would slow down in cold water and speed up in warm water. Imagine on the horizontal axis here, we imagine different values of that single synaptic weight. So I'm writing W for weight here with no subscript to remind us that in this very simple example now, with vehicle 1, we're thinking about just one synaptic weight. Here might be photophilia. We want to find a value, photophilia. We want to find a value for that single synaptic weight that'll cause the robot to slow down, not photo, thermophilia. We want that vehicle 1 to slow down in warm water and speed up in cold water. It's actually hard to think up what that value should be. So let's assume there is actually a fitness landscape underneath. Unbeknownst to us, a synaptic weight of plus 0.8 actually will produce the behavior we want, and some other value will produce the opposite, whatever we don't want. The problem with evolutionary algorithms, remember, is that climbing this fitness landscape, the evolutionary algorithm is blind to the shape of this fitness landscape. So if the evolutionary algorithm starts by dropping some random points, it's unlikely to land on the top of the global optimum. If it drops a whole bunch of random points, what does the evolutionary algorithm actually see? It sees this. Remember, we talked about climbing Mount Mansfield in complete fog and you don't have Wi-Fi on your phone. All you know is your current height. That's what the evolutionary algorithm sees. So if you're this point right here, how does the evolutionary algorithm know whether an increase in the value of W or a decrease in the value of W will produce a higher point, a more fit offspring? This is the problem that evolutionary algorithms face, or any optimization algorithm faces. So far, so good? Okay. Imagine that we simulate our robot in such a way, and we're going to talk about exactly how to do this in a moment, that now the optimizer can see a little bit. It can see local slopes. So you and your friends are out hiking on Mount Mansfield. You're all standing at different positions on Mount Mansfield. You're all at different heights, and you can see about 10 feet around yourself. You can see a little bit in what direction to go. You don't have much information, but it's some. What's the best thing you can do? It's not a trick question.
Go up.
Go up, right? Absolutely. So use the information that you have and take a small step. You're still on the face of a mountain surrounded by fog, so probably not a good idea to take big steps or sprint 10 meters and then see how you do. Take a small step according to your local slope. Yeah. We've been talking in this course so far about maximizing fitness values, so trying to go up in terms of fitness, the thing that you want. We're going to now switch. Instead of talking about fitness, we're going to talk about loss. And instead of trying to go up, we're going to try and minimize loss. We're going to try and minimize error, minimize inaccuracy, minimize silly walks, do less and less of silly walks. We're going to try and reduce the stuff we don't want. That's what loss means in general. So now it's exactly the same algorithm. We've got local slopes, but now we're going to walk down. Not surprisingly, this optimizer that we're talking about is called gradient descent. Okay. Some of you have taken a machine learning course here or have taken a tutorial online. You've heard about this algorithm. It's very famous, very useful. It's what produces Claude and ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion. This is what's going under the hood there. What we're going to look at now in the bleeding edge of robotics research is how to take this optimizer, which works very well for neural networks, where you can easily find these local slopes, and we're going to port it to robotics, where it's much harder to find or compute these local slopes or these local gradients. I'm going to show you how we do that in a moment, but I want to make sure we all have the right intuition. Okay. When we port this to robotics, we're going to talk about behavioral loss. So, as always, assume I want to design a robot or optimize a robot to travel as far to the right as possible. If a robot does this, it's got higher behavioral loss than a robot that does this. So we're going to think about minimizing behavioral inefficiency. How bad is a given robot at doing whatever we want it to do? And we're going to try and descend or decrease that badness. And as we do, we're going to get robots eventually that travel further and further to the right, non-randomly. When you're out there with your friends and you take a step according to the local slope, you're not guessing. You know the local slope, so you know immediately which direction to move in. As you can already figure out, gradient descent is way better than evolutionary algorithms because of this local information. But gradient descent is not perfect either. It has a big Achilles heel. What is it? It still gets stuck at local optima. So let's assume we're this descender here. It follows its local slope. Its new local slope is here. It's now sitting here. It follows this slope again here. And now it sees this slope and goes back to where it was before, and it's stuck. Unbeknownst to this descender, there is actually a lower valley somewhere else. It can only see local gradients, not global gradients. So gradient descent and evolutionary algorithms get stuck in local optima, suboptimal solutions. The field of machine learning has kind of overcome this problem. How have they overcome this problem?
Change the learning rate.
Change the learning rate. Okay, so let's talk about learning rate. What does learning rate mean here? It's the amount you're willing to step in either direction. High learning rate, you take a big step. Small learning rate, you take a smaller step. Learning rate helps, but people were playing with learning rates long before the current AI high summer. It helps, but it wasn't the main solution. I should actually probably not be saying solution. The machine learning community as a whole kind of just sidestepped this whole problem by
implementing different optimizers like Adam W.
So you can get fancier and fancier at estimating gradients and how you take steps, which is what you're talking about, different neural network architectures. But that all came a little bit later. So in the early 2000s, what was the realization about how to get this whole thing to work?
Just started at different points.
Start at different points. Yep, so that also helps. Remember our discussion about a serial hill climber? So just one walker versus having parallel walkers also helps, but it wasn't the magic bullet. Guess the early 2000s are far enough in the past. We're forgetting what happened. In the example we've been looking at so far this morning, and now I am going to draw the landscape. Remember that the gradient descent can't see it. It can only see locally. There's lots of local optima. Here's one. Here's one. We'll make this one the global optimum. Imagine we add a second weight. So now we've got W sub 1 and W sub 2. So now I need you to imagine a two-dimensional loss surface. And the third dimension, height, is still loss, how good something is. So we're trying to move down into a basin. What's the likelihood that, I can't draw this very well in 3D, that if we're sitting here, obviously if this walker moves left, meaning decrease W1, or move right, meaning increase W1, things get worse. What's the chance, I'll try drawing this here, what's the chance that if this walker also walks one step out of the board towards you all, that it's also going to get worse? And if we were to take a step backwards into the classroom behind us, it would also get worse. In all four directions, things are always going to get worse. Think about this local optima and this local optima. What's happening when we added a new parameter to our system?
It's adding more space for it to search, so it's less likely for it to get stuck.
We've added more space. We've increased the dimensionality of the loss surface. Everybody see that? And as you mentioned, it gets easier because there's less local optima, but why? There could be more local optima. Why are there less when we increase the dimensionality of the loss surface? We give gradient descent more knobs to twiddle. It does, in fact, get trapped in local optima less because it's less likely that every direction you point in is up, right? If we added, now I really can't draw this because now we're in 4 dimensions. If we add W3, that means that a walker sitting on a 3-dimensional loss surface is considering moving left, right, forward, and back, and the third horizontal direction as well. There's 6 possible ways it can move now. What's the chance? If it's sitting around here, what's the chance that in all 6 of those directions, if the walker were to move in any one of those 6 directions, things would always get worse? The probability is starting to go down. It may be that heading in any one of 5 directions goes up, but in the 6th direction, you can go down. This is known as a saddle point. Again, I can't draw very well. In this horizontal direction, things look worse in either direction, but in this direction, in these 2 directions, things look better. So we can keep increasing the dimensionality and increase the chance that we escape from local optima if we're able to estimate these gradients in all these different directions. Turns out that's hard to do if you only have a little bit of training data. So the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet is data. The big thing that made all of this work in the early 2000s was the accumulation of more and more training data for AI models. So if you are an AI model and you are sitting on a high-dimensional loss landscape and you have a lot of data to understand well your local landscape, you can be very confident in the local gradients. You know whether stepping in that direction is going to take you up, worse, or down, better. Okay, that's my canned history of modern AI. Great, but what does this mean in terms of robotics? How do we do this with robots? That's what we're going to look at now. As always in this class, we're going to start by thinking about how to change the neural controller inside the robot first. We're going to try and change the brain of the robot non-randomly according to gradient descent. Then, can we do the same thing with the body? Can we alter the body non-randomly as well? Okay. What a surprise. We're going to start with our good friend, the lover, the photophilic robot. We've got 2 light sensors on the front, 2 wheels on the back, and we've got contralateral connections. Right sensor connected to the left wheel, left sensor connected to the right wheel. No stress, no anxiety, very familiar territory. We turn on a flashlight to the front left of this robot. Light hits this sensor more strongly than the light hits this sensor. You all remember how this goes, right? Okay. Let's start to think about a few parameters. So we were just drawing parameters or dials that the gradient descent algorithm can change. One of them, some of these parameters, as I just mentioned, might be morphological. They might have to do with the body. I'm going to pick some here kind of arbitrarily. Let's consider the horizontal position of this light sensor, where it's sitting on the front of the robot. Here's me randomly turning this knob, which we're going to call X. Okay. Does moving this light sensor more to the left make this robot a better photophilic robot or worse?
With this data point, it makes it better.
Why?
It gets closer to the light, so it's going to have a higher light reading and then more motor output.
Possibly. So by moving this light sensor to the left, it means, as you say, it's closer to the light source, meaning there's more light falling on this sensor and more light falling on this sensor relative to this sensor. Sounds good, doesn't it? This is a trick question. It doesn't necessarily make things better. Why not? We haven't mentioned anything about W1 or W2 here. We don't know about these synaptic weights. Even if these 2 values are pretty good, meaning the robot tends to move left towards the light, what might happen if we suddenly move the left sensor further to the left? What could happen? Run your internal Bratenberg vehicle simulation. This wheel is now spinning even more strongly relative to this wheel. Sounds good in theory, but in practice, what can happen?
It's just gonna go in a circle,
In a circle, possibly.
spin.
What else might happen here?
Rotates, turns away from the light and stops.
Remember that in theory, this all sounds good, but in reality, these sensors have a refresh rate. They can take a value, and then 60th of a second later, they can take another value. It's possible, under certain conditions, that the robot would turn too much, and now what's the situation once it's turned past the light? Now what's happening?
Now it's got to like swing back and just jitter towards it.
So imagine now it's facing this direction. Now there's more light falling on the right sensor. And remember, the sensors are now horizontally further apart. What's it going to do? It's going to turn back, right? So now you have a very conflicted robot that is not doing photophilia. It's bouncing back and forth. So by making this change, even this simple change, it's not so obvious how to change X so that things get better. Going back to our walker on a lost landscape, it can't estimate the gradient very well here. It doesn't actually know what to do. Okay, let's keep going. We're going to start calling this the forward pass. So imagine in the simulation during a single time step, light falls on this sensor, light falls on this sensor. We multiply this amount of light in lumens by theta. Sorry, I switched from W to theta. We're going to use theta for the synaptic weights. multiply this sensor neuron value by this synaptic weight, and the result of that multiplication dictates omega. Omega is going to represent the turning speed of the wheel. So this is measured in lumens. It's just a floating point number. Synaptic weight is a floating point number. Omega is a single floating point number, let's say 0.7. Let's say it represents 0.7 radians per second. Or it could be degrees per second. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. Bigger positive values mean rotate the wheel forward faster. A value of 0 means hold the wheel still. Bigger and bigger, higher magnitude negative numbers means spin the wheel backwards faster and faster. Yeah? Okay. Let's think about these 3 parameters for a moment. When we build a simulation, if we were to build a simulation of this Bratenberg vehicle, we, the humans, are usually responsible for X. We tell the physics engine where to place the sensor. The physics engine is responsible for computing omega. It's the one that figures out radians per second according to these other parameters. And we, humans, usually set the weight ourselves, or we let the optimizer set them. So we've got different parameters, and different entities are responsible for setting or changing these values. Okay. All right, so we take omega, and we're still continuing the forward pass. Let's imagine that this omega is more positive than this omega, which means, sorry, I misspoke. The black arrow, this is what we want the robot to do. Yeah? We have a loss function. There's the thing that we want it to do. The loss function is very much like the fitness function. It's what we want the robot to do. Imagine that whatever these x values are, whatever these 2 theta values are, and whatever the resulting 2 omegas are, the robot does this. It actually turns away from the light. Regardless of whether we're running an evolutionary algorithm or gradient descent, we usually start with random values. We drop solutions at random locations onto the fitness landscape or the loss landscape. So in this case, let's assume that maybe we've set X manually, non-randomly. We've put one sensor here and one sensor here. We don't know what the 2 weights should be, so we set those values randomly, and we got unlucky. We dropped this particular pair of synaptic weights up here. We want to get low in a loss landscape. So we were unlucky, and the robot turned away from the light. I've put L for loss between the desired behavior and the actual behavior. High loss. If you think about the area between, if we were to take the area between these 2 arrows, there's a lot of area. There's high behavioral loss. The robot is doing a terrible job at whatever we want it to do. So far, so good? Okay, we've completed the forward pass. We've gone all the way from simulated light to simulated sensor values to simulated rotational velocities of the wheels to simulated change in the position and orientation of the robot, which gives us the red arrow, all the way to loss. So in the end, we get back L, another floating point value, which is how bad things are. We're now going to start the backward pass. We're in essence going to run this special simulator in reverse. We're going to go backwards from L to omega to theta to X, to the light source if we want. That's the backward pass. For those that have taken a machine learning course before, or if you're familiar with forward and backward passes, is this sounding familiar? Okay, all right. For those that haven't seen this before, how do we do this backward pass? It's a little complicated, so I'm going to make some simplifications for our purposes this morning. The first thing we can compute is dl over d omega. What does this represent? What does this mean? First year calculus. It's okay. How exactly? How loss changes as a function of angular velocity. So let's go back to our loss landscape. Let's restrict ourselves for the moment to just a single parameter, omega. For this solution here that we're looking at, this collection of x, thetas, and omegas, there's a particular slope here. This local slope is represented by this value here. Okay, given your expertise with physics engines, your expertise with Bratenberg vehicles, and your expertise with this specific example, what is dl over d omega here? It's a single floating point value. Is it positive, negative, y? At y. We know, because we can see the shape of this, we know what this slope should be. Here's a way to think about this. Remember that omega is on the horizontal axis down here. So let's take the denominator first. Change in omega, local change. We're not going to get crazy. We're just going to think about changing omega, increasing omega by a little bit, or decreasing omega by a little bit. That's what d omega means. If we change omega, if we increase omega by a little bit, what happens to L? We increase omega a little bit. What does that mean for the wheel?
It goes more towards the light.
The wheel, we're not there yet. We're not back at L. We're just at the wheel. What does it mean for omega to be a little bit larger?
Spins faster.
The wheel spins a little bit faster, and you're running your physics engine in your head, which is fine. If we move a little bit here, that means the robot, this wheel is going to turn a little bit faster, and this red arrow is going to be a little bit closer to the black arrow. We're basically running things forward again in our head. If we were to decrease omega decrease it by a little bit, we slow down the wheel, what happens to L?
Loss is going to increase.
Loss is going to increase. So at this point, it knows, did I get this right? Is this drawn right? Increasing omega helps. Decreasing omega hurts. So I've got it wrong. We'll put our little walker back here, and we'll do this. So the dl over dw represents the slope at this point, first year calculus. It's a negative slope. Increasing omega decreases L, at least locally. Everybody see that? Okay. So let's keep a running list here. So we've got dl over d omega here. Sorry. D omega over here. It's a negative number. I'll just write negative next to it. Apologies for the poor notation. I want to get through this in the next 5 minutes. Okay. Here we go. Deep breath. Let's assume, remember that omega is being set by the physics engine. So we're not going to take this gradient information and change omega because we, the human, or we, gradient descent, or us, we're not responsible for this variable. The value of this variable is being set by the physics engine. So we know how omega should change to make this robot do more of what we want it to do, but we don't have ownership over this variable. So we skip over it. We've computed the gradient, but we haven't applied the gradient. Let's take one step backwards in the backward pass. We know that omega the value of omega is dependent on theta, the strength of this synaptic weight. This times a small value produces a small omega. This times a large value is a larger omega. So what we'd actually like to know is what is the gradient for theta? And then once we know what that local gradient is for theta, we change it. We do take a small step along that gradient according to some learning rate. But how do we know how to change omega? We can use the chain rule, which you hopefully dimly remember. I don't know about you, but when I was a student, we spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks in class on the chain rule. I thought, who the heck would ever want to use this? Why is this important? This is why it's important. It's running our technological infrastructure as we speak. How does this work? What we want to know is dl over d theta. We want to know, now I'm going to put theta on the horizontal axis. I want to know which direction to change theta. I want to know whether to increase or decrease theta to decrease L, the thing I always want to do. How do we get dl over d theta? Well, we already know dl over d omega, and we know that the way in which omega changes is a function of theta. When we change theta, we know exactly how the physics engine is going to change omega. It's down in the physics of the physics engine. So we can ask the physics engine for this local slope. What is this local slope? What is the physics engine going to tell us? Is d omega over d theta positive or negative or zero? We're looking at just this derivative here. What happens as you change theta a little bit? How does omega change in response?
Probably assume that it's like the linear correlation, increase one and increases the other, so positive.
It's definitely linear because we're talking about gradient, local slope. Slope is a straight line, so it's linear. But which slope? Is it this slope or this slope? It's the positive slope. How do we know?
Because increasing one increases the other.
Because increasing one increases the other. Increasing this synaptic weight ensures in the physics engine that omega increases. The physics engine is doing it, so if we ask it, it'll give us back this floating point number. I don't know what positive floating point number it is. It depends on the physics engine. 0.6, 0.9, 129.3, doesn't matter. It's positive. This one is negative. Using the chain rule here, if we multiply these two known slopes together, this positive number times a negative number gives us back how L changes as a function of theta. Now we know. How does L change as a function of theta? A positive number times a negative number is a negative number. As we increase theta, we know if we increase theta by a small amount, we know that L will decrease. So if we're looking at just the theta part of the loss landscape, here we now know the slope is negative. We know that we should decrease. We know that if we decrease theta by a small amount, loss will increase. So what do? Do we decrease theta or increase theta? We're now going to take a small step according to that gradient. We're going to apply that gradient. A lot of double negatives here. What do? We knew this gradient, but we didn't apply it because omega is the physics engine's responsibility. This gradient we now know. We are going to apply it because, or gradient descent is going to apply it because gradient descent is responsible for tuning or setting or improving the thetas. What do?
Do we decrease it? Because that will cause the other gradient to increase.
So, okay. The reason we applied the chain rule here is now we have a direct relationship between theta and the thing we actually care about. We can now, for the moment, ignore everything else. We know the slope is negative. What do we do with theta? Do we take a small step to the right or a small step to the left? A small step to the left, right? Remember, we're always trying to bring down L. So we now know non-randomly, and it's taken us a while to get here, this is why we can finally shrug off the evolutionary algorithm. We know the local slope, and we can now change theta non-randomly. Okay, I think that's a good place to pause for today. You have a quiz due tonight. You're finishing up your second deliverable. I'll post deliverable 3 later today, and I will see you again on Thursday. Thank you.